Hello and welcome everyone to the fifth part of our Jesus Futures series, The Future of Education. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, particularly on what is such a lovely day, certainly here in Oxford. So thank you so much for joining us for this, what will be an absolutely fascinating hour of discussion. I've had a meeting with Kathy and Pam last week, and it's going to be a very exciting, informative session. Just as a quick reminder, if you could try and keep all cameras and mics off throughout the session, that'll be really helpful just in case of bandwidth issues. And also, if you have any questions, we'll ask them at the end. If you could just type them into the chat box, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So without further ado, I will introduce our three speakers for this evening. First of all, we're going to be joined by Pamela Sammons, who's a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Education here at the University of Oxford and an Emeritus Fellow right here at Jesus College. Previously, she was a Professor at the School of Education in the University of Nottingham and a Professor at the Institute of Education at the University of London. Her research over 4 decades has focused on school effectiveness and improvement, school leadership, teaching quality, and promoting equity in education. She's provided advice to government and inspection agencies in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Sweden, and engaged in educational effectiveness studies in various European countries. She's been a governor of primary and secondary schools in Oxford and London and has worked as a consultant for the OUP in developing its online resources to support school improvement and develop an overarching strategy to evaluate the impact of its services and products. She's currently working as an academic advisor at the University of Stavanger for a study video coaching for teachers' professional learning. I'm also delighted to welcome, in fact, on the same camera in our very own Ship Street Centre, Kathy Sylva, who is an honorary research fellow and professor of educational psychology at Oxford's Department of Education and another emeritus fellow here at Jesus. She has conducted large-scale studies on the effects of early education and care on children's development in high and low-income countries. She's been a specialist advisor to parliamentary select committees, is a fellow of the British Academy and the National Academy of Social Sciences. She received an OBE for services to children and families and the British Educational Research Association's Nisbet Award for outstanding contribution to research. And finally, we're delighted to welcome from our friends at St. Peter's College, alumna of St. Peter's, Megan Greet, who is the head of a growing sixth form at an all-through academy in North London, established in the wake of the 2011 London riots, to specifically respond to local community's call for an excellent school to better serve their children and young people. She has previously worked as an assistant principal responsible for outcomes, curriculum, and assessment, as well as director of education for Sane's Black Dog campaign and a lead within the Institute of Physics, Capital Physics, and Gender Equality projects. Meg has been a whole school lead for equality and diversity and joined the teaching profession through PGCE, taken right here in Oxford at the Department of Education. And once again, she is joined us from our friends at St. Peter's, where she took a first-class degree in physics. Welcome all three of you. Welcome to Jesus Futures. So I'm going to start by posing a first question to Kathy. What, in your view, Kathy, are the most pressing issues in education that will shape its future?
Okay, there are 2 pressing views, and nobody will be surprised. The most pressing challenge for education is funding. All public services have exactly the same problem. And in a way, this is the elephant in the room because it is the biggest problem. And I'm not going to talk about that as a big lump. It's too big a topic for today, but we'll be touching on it because the other problem that is really facing education is the inequality, that we have children from poor backgrounds, from ethnic minority backgrounds, children who live in communities where they wouldn't normally go to university or get top jobs. These will be white communities in England. These children really don't have a fair deal in education. They don't do well in their outcomes. They don't go on top jobs. And also we know from Sir Michael Marmot's work that their health outcomes are also bad. So we have these twin problems. We have money and we have inequality. But I'm going to talk about inequality because Pam and I, in our research work, we have more to say about what we can do about inequality. So I'm going to quickly go through COVID and how the inequalities that were there before COVID are now even more stark. A study done by the Sutton Trust about a year and 2 months ago, asked parents of preschool children 3 to 5, how is your child's development compared to pre-pandemic? And you won't be surprised, the parents talked about physical development lagging behind. Children of 2 who used to be able to walk upstairs because they did it in their preschool, or they did it when they went out. Now they can't even go upstairs. Language development has been knocked back, especially when I'm talking with people who are outside the family, and personal, social, and emotional development. So parents got it right. They knew that children's development is lagging behind. In primary school, a study done in the United States on 5 million children, and looked at, are children doing as well as we expect them before the pandemic? And they took just reading and math. And they found that in reading, children were doing about 63% of children were doing as well after COVID as they might have been doing. But obviously that's a huge percent who are not. And in maths, only 40% were doing as well. So we know we have, COVID has caused this equity gap. It was there before COVID, but it's got worse and worse. Now, what are some other things going wrong? Because Pam and Megan are going to talk about things we might do.
Could I just jump in very quickly to say this is entirely the fault of the microphone of the Ship Street Centre, but just to say that the sound is picking up quite muffled. So if you mind sort of very much projecting sort of lecture style. So sorry to put that, but that is entirely down to the tech in the Ship Street Centre.
Okay. Well, there are 2 great challenges. The one is money and the other one is inequality, okay? And we know that children's development is falling behind. But what is particularly interesting for today is that the development of poorer children is falling behind quicker and quicker. We know, for example, that children in private schools, their development has not fallen behind as badly. And a very careful study carried out quite recently on the quality of work submitted, a lot of it submitted online. If you look at it, for deciles of income, you find this sad rating. The quality of work of richer children is not suffering very much at all. And as you go down the deciles of income, the quality of their work is getting worse and worse. So one more fact before we turn to Pam and Megan for what we can do about it is studies have been done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, about what happens in the home when children are home from school. And what we found out is that fathers are doing more childcare because fathers are at home. So this is a good thing, and you might think that's a plus. But mothers are doing a little more childcare. But while mothers are doing childcare, often they are also at work. They're doing remote work for their job. And so it's the burden on homeschooling has fallen unfairly on mothers. And the burden of homeschooling is very, very pressing on children in disadvantaged families because they don't have a room to work. They may have a phone to do their schoolwork on. They don't have protected time. So I'm going to go back to you, Peter. These are the problems. We don't have enough money, but we have this increasing inequity and inequality. So what can we do about it? And I pass back to Peter.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kathy. So Pam, I'll pose it over to you. So the issues of equity that Kathy has outlined, what do you think are the promising approaches that we can use to combat these?
Well, I think it's very important that we acknowledge that to combat inequity, and we've worked together for over 20 years, Kathy and I, on many projects from the early years right through different phases of schooling. I've been in the field for 40 years and Kathy also for a long period. But we need to combat inequity. We need to understand the nature of the barriers to equity, and Kathy's alluded to some. but especially the impact of poverty and other sorts of disadvantage in the UK, and how that poverty has increased. And of course, at the moment, we're all aware of the cost of living crisis that will affect already disadvantaged families and communities in most ways. One of the positives is that educational research has produced much evidence to inform policy and reform. And we were delighted today to have the REF 21 and the Research Excellence Framework results for education. We were talking about it in our department this morning. Research has played a huge role, and we have in fact got a case study on early years and the policy impact that we have had there. Some of the promising initiatives that need to be further developed are to counter poverty and inequities in the early years. We did have policies that did invest in early years. We had we were the poor man or woman of Europe for preschool, but from 1998 onwards, successively, we started to have free preschool provision for children from age 4, then from age 3, and for the disadvantaged from age 2 years. And that still continues. We evaluated more recently the impact of Sure Start Children's Centre here in Oxford, and that confirmed positive effects for families of that early years provision, which is very important and was especially relevant to children and families from high disadvantaged communities. Sadly, there have been massive local authority cuts over the last decade in the austerity era, and that has cut services, youth services, schools' resources in relative terms have gone right down, particularly schools serving the most disadvantaged communities. But what we do know from our research is that early intervention is important to support families and young children, and giving a better start to school should be a key policy goal. And that's particularly important given the current cost of living challenge. But if I turn to schools now, because Kathy's talked quite a bit about early years and the COVID, I think one of the key challenges, and Megan may come back to this in her contribution, is the narrow accountability agenda that has been driving the system increasingly hard over the last couple of decades. But it serves particular pressures, it creates particular pressures for schools serving the most disadvantaged communities. And what we really want with education is to strive to support the maximum all-round development of children. So the academics important, the cognitive side is important, but so is social-emotional development, the broad curriculum, and the health and well-being of children. And we know there's a lot of concern about mental health issues in the children of all ages, young people, and COVID again potentially has exacerbated that. So what we would argue is the intention for education policy should be to promote the future happiness and prosperity of society and to counter the inequalities linked to background and disadvantage that we've got massive research to document. So let's get back to this test-driven agenda. And some of you may have seen in the Times this week, there's been an education summit. And some of these problems have been alluded to. We've been thinking about it for a long while in educational research. The test-driven agenda is pernicious in its effects. The English obsession with frequent, what we call high-stakes testing and monitoring is internationally an outlier. We do more of it at more ages across time. And it's widely regarded as excessive. School performance tables have created strong pressures to teach to the test, especially at the primary level. And there's no longer any official recognition of the powerful links between student background and attainment performance. So schools serving the most disadvantaged communities are penalised by that lack of recognition. And that's an additional challenge they then face in trying to support the children and young people that they serve. The decision to remove the contextualisation of schools' results was taken in 2010. It was a political decision. Contextualisation was brought in the late 1990s by both Ofsted and the DfE separately. But it was removed in 2010, and that again puts pressures on schools that face the greatest challenges. And Kathy's already alluded to the fact that these communities also suffer the greatest challenges in terms of health inequalities with the Marmot review. So the problems of curriculum narrowing, teaching to the test and the effects of the accountability system on teacher recruitment and retention particularly affect certain kinds of schools. So that's the problem. What to do about it? Well, last summer, the British Educational Research Association, of which we are long-standing members, they set up a policy task group 2 years ago, and we launched a report last summer, and we proposed an alternative to the standardised assessment tasks that are used in all primary schools. Over 4 million children are assessed with the SACs every year at different ages. But we wanted to put proposals together, carefully thought through, to transform and reform the testing and accountability system in primary education. But we think there are implications for older age groups. I won't talk about secondary. I know Megan will tell you about experiences in her school. So we launched a report. It's not a glossy coloured version. I haven't got a colour printer here, but it was called High Standards, Not High Stakes. And it was based on 2 years studying the system and exploring international practice. And our VERA report proposes to reform testing and inspection through a new system of what we call intelligent and democratic accountability for schools with independent oversight. And I may hand back for you to ask me a further question.
Oh, certainly, yes. It was actually, could you say a bit more about these proposals? They sound really fascinating. Could you let us know what you think, where that future could be heading with those proposals?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, Peter, because our system is the aim is what we call intelligent and democratic accountability. We don't feel we have either intelligent or democratic accountability at the moment. So if we want to decouple accountability from political pressures and short-termism, one of the ways to do that is to create a new independent organisation to manage knowledge gathering for the system as a whole, with groups drawn from all the major stakeholders in education. And we would use, instead of testing every child in every year at certain ages, we would have a new national sample, which would take away the pressures from schools. We would still have assessments and information on progress for parents, but we wouldn't have this high stakes, everybody being assessed in the same year. And we would be able to assess with a national sample, and it's used in some other countries. Particularly Germany has a national education panel system. And we won't be judging school performance just on a narrow set of performance in certain skills like reading and maths. We would develop a new bank of assessment and survey instruments for schools and others to use to support improvement. So it would be improvement focused. And schools could assess children and give information back to parents about progress and development, not just in reading, maths, and academic areas, but socio-emotional development as well. We think the new system will be intelligent because it will be geared to building system knowledge. And by that we mean it will focus on measuring and documenting equity issues in education, the achievement of different groups of students, and how we could support improvement and better meet the needs of all students in our system from different backgrounds, whether we look at gender, race, socioeconomic status, poverty in particular. And it would be more democratic because our idea is that we would focus on meaningful engagement with all the different stakeholders in education. So it would include teachers, school leaders, parents, local authorities, academy chains, and students themselves who should be involved. It would free up significant resources because there's a huge cost to assessing every pupil when they hit 7, when they hit baseline, when they enter education at the age of 5, when they are 7, when there are only 2 years in primary, year 3 and year 5, where we don't have national assessment. So it's a huge cost. We could collect richer information through a national sample more cheaply and reinvest those resources, and also reinvest, close our door, allow teachers time and students learning time to be more focused on learning, not just on being taught to the test and performativity. So the schools could use, we would have richer information on a national longitudinal sample of pupils we would conduct by Emily, and there would be more resources back into schools to focus on learning and to focusing on providing good and rich feedback to parents about their children's progress and development. So, if I could summarise what we see as the benefits for this proposal, pressures to teach to the test and narrow the curriculum would be eliminated, or at least very much reduced. We would reduce the stress for pupils and teachers, which has been highlighted by many researchers and many involved in education, that the high-stakes testing would no longer be high stakes. It would be greater transparency and reduced cost. It would be more authentic assessment. There wouldn't be this teaching to the test and trying to see who we do or don't put into tests to game the system. Better use of resources, I've mentioned, more people and teacher time for learning, and therefore more time for enrichment and enhanced educational experiences for children and pupils, which would be very important. More authentic ways to monitor system equity. What are the achievement gaps? Are they narrowing? Are they increasing? In reducing the pressures in inspection, and inspection being repurposed to try and inform and support school improvement and promote equity, not just being about judging schools, but being about supporting and advising on improvement. And it would build on best international practice. For example, the OECD in 2021 advocates sample-based monitoring and using a broad range of outcomes. Germany has advocated this. Sample-based monitoring is used in some other English-speaking countries, including New Zealand and so on. So I think that is, in a nutshell, what we propose to try and combat the pernicious effect of our accountability high-stakes system. Thank you, Peter.
Fantastic. So I'll bring Megan at this point. So in your experience as a teacher, do the views of Kathy and Pam, does your experience confirm their views, or do you want to challenge them?
So I think we've kind of looked at quite a lot of aspects across what Kathy and Pam have been sharing. And I think sort of firstly, yes, in a broad sense, there are many things that I think are echoed in the kind of individual experiences of teachers as they drive forward in trying to do the best for every student, but most especially do the best for students who may have some form of disadvantage. I was heartened to hear Pam highlight that disadvantage, which we too often hear about as an equivalence of financial deprivation or being poor, actually is much more multifaceted than that. Our families, and we feel quite strongly about this, are not disadvantaged. Our children are not disadvantaged by virtue of the families in which they exist. Our parents have very high aspirations for their children. Our parents endeavour to provide a home learning environment that will enable their children to succeed. There is, however, a specific financial disadvantage. And I think it's really important that we break down children's disadvantage into the many ways in which they may be impacted, either transiently by events that happen in their lives, or long term by the circumstances in which they find themselves for an extended period of time. So I think it's firstly really important that we separate out disadvantage, because the response to a financial deprivation within a family, or the lack of capacity to provide certain things at home, is very different to responding to the cultural entitlement that I think we should expect for all children. So the experiences that they might not have outside of school that we can therefore facilitate. So certainly, financial disadvantage plays an enormous role in what we do as a school. And I think the funding streams and the way in which funding provision has changed over the years has created a particular difficulty within schools, but also within post-16 provision. The idea that we have a bursary that we give children that they have to spend before they can have the money seems an incredibly counterintuitive policy that is representative of quite a lot of what we see when it comes to funding for schools. They are streams that are apparently deliberately, you occasionally reflect, apparently deliberately quite difficult to spend effectively within your school. If a child cannot afford to buy a textbook, they cannot afford to buy a textbook and then reclaim the money for it. So that movement, especially in post-16, whereby funding comes through a reclaim basis, rather than the old system whereby students staying in education post 16 were granted money, really has an impact on the kind of day-to-day operational aspect of what we can do to better support some of those students' learning. Assessment is certainly, assessment and I suppose inspection alongside that are huge dictators of the practice and what we do within schools. And I think when Pam highlighted that the removal of contextualisation of school results after 2010, I think that's always been sold to schools or among schools as a sort of, well, that's an ambition. Why shouldn't we expect the same for our children who are coming from poorer households with lower incomes? Absolutely. We should not only expect that for them, but we should consider it their educational entitlement to make the same gains within school as their wealthier peers. However, we know that making that progress rests on an enormous amount of hard work and extraordinary provision by schools. So that should also be recognised, that financial disadvantage is a disadvantage. And if we are serving more of those children and they are making greater gains across the phase of school, let's say secondary, relative to where they came in, that should be recognised within the context that it echoes. I think sort of further to that, inspection, Ofsted has moved away from a results-based inspection and now doesn't disregard but looks much less at results. And unfortunately, I think that's not had the kind of impact that they've extolled it. They've extolled its virtues as a system whereby we're looking at a broad and balanced curriculum. But arguably, if we have children who are not reaching particular levels in maths and literacy, our first commitment to them should be to ensure that they do have those skills. And so whilst I'm a very strong advocate of a broad and balanced curriculum, I also think that we shouldn't be led into artificially broadening that curriculum and adding in Latin for every single child that we have in our school, to the detriment of the work that we're actually doing with their core skills and those skills that are going to set them up to have those results that will open doors to them. So it's a fine balance and certainly one that I don't think has been well managed by Ofsted in either of the kind of forms of that as an inspection body. So finally, when we come to kind of assessment overall, I agree that there is a very high stakes sense of assessment in England. I think that we've moved completely away from coursework among the vast majority of A-level subjects and GCSEs, and that has meant that we've now got an assessment system that really caters for one student rather than the range of individuals that we host at any school. However, when it comes to sort of restructuring that assessment system and looking at longer term progress of a school, so testing less often and taking a sort of longitudinal sample, I think that risks not measuring the very worthy endeavour that individual schools do undertake in making significant changes to students' achievement within 1 year. Having overseen jumps in progress of over 1.5 grades within 6 months within schools, for those children's assessment results not to count for them, as well as to recognise the effort and endeavour of the school within a single year, I think is perhaps a little counterintuitive to the very rapid gains that can be made when schools go through transformation, either through change in leadership, change in structure, change in the approach to curriculum. And so I would want to hear more about how those sharp transformations of results and outcomes for those individual children would still be measured underneath such an assessment system.
I think, yes, Pam, do you want to come in on that?
I might come back. I deliberately, and the BERA proposal is deliberately for primary age children. It's not saying that we should, and I'm not one, there are debates about whether we should abolish GCSEs. I actually think particularly for very disadvantaged students, working towards GCSEs can be very motivating. And our own research suggested that attitude, well, we follow children from 3 through to 16 and then followed up their A-level results. So yes, I wasn't intending that we should say we get rid of the assessment in secondary, because those examinations can open doors, as you rightly said, Megan. It was more for the primary age group that these proposals were made for key stage 2, which is when children are in year 6 of primary education. But I think there are implications we need. I think you rightly mentioned that there was a move away from that continuous assessment, and we saw how badly that served the system when exams couldn't be held in summer 2020. I think we need a range of forms of assessment for young people at different ages, and we do want to recognise the gains and the progress they have made in schools, I think, and give credit to the schools where that's happened, as well as credit to the young people and allowing exams to open opportunities for them. But Kathy wants to come in too.
I'll be really quick. An exam that we might get rid of in the primary would be the phonics check. Now, phonics are really important, and it's really useful for teacher to know the phonics skills of every child in their classroom. But I don't know why it has to be on one day of the year that parents have to really be waiting for this exam, for the school to be so worried and so upset and get it reported publicly. It seems to me phonics tests are really useful, probably one of the most useful things we have in teaching early reading. But I don't know that they need to be a national assessment done on one day with real high stakes. Teachers should have access to very good assessments, and that would help them to know how each child's doing, and they would use it to improve their teaching, and it would be one mega national test, and I think we'd save a lot of money for them.
So, Meg, do you want to come in again on that?
Sorry, if you can hear me now. Just from a sort of secondary perspective, I think that what Kathy's described there and the potential successes in that system were actually borne out by the very different experiences of the 2020 and the 2021 teacher awarded grades. So in 2020, the government said, we're just going to crack on and let teachers do their job, because apparently teachers had become trained examiners who were expected to predict grades on the basis of no evidence. And the way in which the government framed what teachers were supposed to do over both years was frankly appalling. But the difference of experience as an individual and as the head of data and assessment at my school, I oversaw the processes in both years, was stark. In the first year, it was about trying to visualize or conceptualize the idea that there had been an exam and then award a grade that we had somehow plucked out of thin air that a child would get on that individual day, which, as you say, is heavily impacted by the day itself and very unpredictable events that mean that exams themselves generally give unpredictable results for some students as well. And then compare that to the year after in 2021, where that progress in 2021 was done rigorously, which was very centre dependent because of the lack of central guidance and the scurrying around for process at a very late stage in the day. Nonetheless, when done well, it gave teachers an incredible insight into their students across a period of about 3 months, where we were constantly assessing in a, I suppose, medium stakes environment. These were all contributing towards the final grade that we were going to award our students. They knew that, and yet they knew that we would be looking at their essays in 1 week, and then we'd look at an essay again in another week, and we would continue to build a portfolio of evidence for students. So whilst there were huge flaws in the way in which that awarding system was carried out, and I don't think that we could say there was consistency between centres, where that worked well and where it was done well with underpinning training for every individual teacher and then further training for heads of departments and collaborative working between centres. So I'm very fortunate to be part of a large multi-academy trust. We had a lot of that. teachers benefited from the knowledge of moderation and examination and standardization. And I think we got a much more comprehensive picture of our students' attainment as both practitioners and as kind of de facto examiners than we would in any other given year of just a single day or 2 days of examinations in any given subject.
Fantastic. I'm aware of time because I want to allow enough time for audience questions. So I'm just going to skip to the final two, which I think we could all feed into. But I'll start with Pam, because you mentioned some ways forward for education in the future. I always like to ask these questions to Jesus Futures series because we are naturally drawn to the challenges. What are your hopes? Is there some glimmer of hope there that things might be better, might move forward in the direction you specify?
Yeah, there are many positive developments in education, and our own Oxnet Schools partnership here, the university has set up, is working with schools often in disadvantaged communities to support improvement. The project I've got links with going on in Warrington. I think Meg's contribution shows how highly committed teachers working in one of the most disadvantaged contexts. I think you said your school is in one of the most disadvantaged ward in the country in terms of measures of disadvantage, but good people from Oxford bringing high quality education experiences. I think that's excellent. The Jesus College Digital Hub in the Chan building, the Internet Institute, the ways we can support the new developments in AI may all be important. But I think I'm particularly pleased that the Office for Fair Access and Higher Education are increasingly recognising the powerful effects of disadvantage, and they deliberately want the system to take note of that in making offers to students. So I think that is important to widen participation and equity. And Kathy and I have worked in research for the Sutton Trust, which have looked at the drivers of success for high disadvantaged students who were doing well in primary, and then what leads to success at A-level and opens up higher education opportunities. So that throws light on enrichment activities, the home learning environment that Meg's mentioned, the quality of preschool Kathy's talked about, and support from schools are very important. And the OUP has developed a whole, here in Oxford, it's the department of the university, the Oxford University Press, they've developed a whole set of resources to support school improvement, many of which are free, and many of the resources are free for parents and schools to download and use, and they've got a whole lot of ebooks for families to use. So with respect, going back to our proposal on high standards, not high stakes, I think that's something we can all support. There's been a lot of interest from teachers and school head teachers, professional associations, some politicians, not all, have shown an interest. And I think the pandemic and the exams debacle of 2020 have highlighted the impact of disadvantage, and we're beginning to address it again and realise after 10 years of austerity which groups have been hit most, and hopefully that's leading to wider recognition of the importance of equity and the problem that high stakes assessment, particularly at the younger age groups, have entailed. So I hope that there are positive moves there, and we don't want to leave on a negative note.
Oh, yes, Kathy.
I'll be really quick. I think there's one thing that Jesus College can do. What we learned in the pandemic is that children really do learn online. There's all kinds of wonderful resources. We saw that richer families supported children to learn. So when they go back to school, they get the real interaction, which is so important. But also online is an important part of learning at school and also learning at home. And I think our internet hub could really look at how we can democratize that, and that it seems to me it's painful that the children who didn't really fall behind were in private schools. I mean, the internet is such a resource, so I hope that our hub will look at educational provision and think about really being imaginative for the future. So I'm going to do that.
And to support the skills, because it's access to the internet, it's access to laptops rather than trying to do things on a smartphone if you're learning. But it's also having that support at home so that you can take advantage of that. So it's digital competence and it's the digital divide. So it's resources and education experiences to support that, because it is so important for everybody, young person's future life. So yeah, thank you, Catherine.
Absolutely. And whilst I just pose one final question, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box. And while we have this final question, please do think some and to have some ready to pose on variety of issues that have come up. So the final question sort of leads on from that. We are the community of Jesus College, whether it be fellows, students, staff, alumni. How can we all personally contribute to helping the education of all our children, basically our future as a society? How can we, what personal contributions can we all make to that?
I'd like to turn to our audience. Do they have ideas?
I mean, many of us have served as school governors, and it's good if we can be governors in communities, not just the most advantaged communities getting a lot to do with neighbourhood effects. But yes, we see what our alumni audience feel they can contribute.
Well, we do have a couple of questions. One was asked quite early on. This might be answered, but I think it's worth posing again, because I think it makes quite a pertinent and more on the challenging side rather than the hope side. A question from David. I suspect that if you'd been presenting this a decade or two ago, you could have said very much the same things you are saying now. This might suggest that the somewhat improved evidence base has not had the impact you might have hoped for. It also suggests that these issues are very hard to change. So in our future, how to move beyond simply saying the same things over and over and hope that someone will finally listen? How do we get this word into, I suppose, the corridors of power? How do we try and persuade them to listen? Which might be easier said than done.
I think we did have a lot of policy impact. The case study that's been put up to do with the ref on impact on early years. I think Kathy and colleagues and I, but particularly led by Kathy, had a big impact on early years and resourcing for earlier years. A huge amounts of money were put in to introduce free preschool provision. So that was a sign of hope. Things have changed since 2010, but the early years investment is still there for preschool. Things like Sure Start have been cut, and that is a casualty of political change. So you have ups and downs. After 40 years, we've seen a number of political changes in our research careers. There was a time when there was a lot more investment in education and when equity was receiving much more attention. Notionally, that's happening now with the levelling up agenda, but whether it will really happen, I don't know. In terms of knowing that our system, our system has got a huge equity, the social class divide. We invented the term, and the reason it fits our system so well is it was developed I think back in the 1920s because it described the way our society functions. So we do have this big equity gap because we've got a tool to measure. In some countries, it might be a caste gap, but we are particularly inequitable when you look in comparisons across the OECD and countries, but our equity gap is particularly high. So we do have real problems here in meeting the needs of all our children. Kathy?
I guess our challenge there was what has changed. And it seems to me there really are big changes. Education is really doing its job because we have many, many more young people getting degrees. We have many, many more people kind of going into apprenticeships, which we hope are going to be better. There has been progress, but somehow the elite still manages to remain elite and powerful. But I think we have had successes in education, and we have to work harder on getting these young people who have degrees at turning them into really good jobs. And I think Jesus College and its alumni has a role there. The schools are doing a pretty good job of helping young people from unusual backgrounds that didn't used to have degrees. They are getting degrees, but they're not doing the next step. And I think that alumni can help there.
Yeah, Meg, I think your hand. Do you want to join the discussion for this bit?
Yeah, just I agree that there is a potentially positive future that we can see there already. I think that what can we do in terms of making sure that our students are in the future equipped to translate those degrees into jobs. Well, it starts much sooner, and it needs to start before post-16 provision. I think we need explicit training on unconscious bias among staff. We need to be really aware as teachers and all staff working at school about our preconceptions about particular groups, either based on prior experiences or the way in which those groups are described or portrayed, particularly about making assumptions about families of those children who are coming to school from lower income backgrounds, and making assumptions about those home learning environments. Having said that, we need to acknowledge that in general, those families where incomes are lower have less capacity to necessarily be around for their children in the evenings if they're working more jobs. And if schools are going to substitute that home learning environment, we need to be funded to do so. There needs to be explicit funding to recognise the disadvantage of the communities that individual schools are serving. And if there is, then I think, speaking as a practitioner, we would all absolutely commit to using that. What can't continue is I think what's happening in schools at the moment, where we are endeavouring to provide that, but we are endeavouring to provide that at a significant disadvantage without any actual resource. So I have students who are still in the study room just around the corner from me. We'll keep this school open until 7 p.m. for them, but realistically, that should be recognised, that the context in which we're working is distinct. And in order to best support those students and provide them with both the online, the tech and the accessibility of online learning, as well as the space and the quiet space to study, the experiences that ensure that they're very, very well informed about their future steps, the experiences that ensure they feel comfortable moving into the space of university and feel comfortable taking their place on the stage in whatever professional environment they may wish to pursue in the future. All those things take time and resource. So yes, I think give us more money if we're trying to work hard for children families don't have.
In fact, as David has put in the comment, I did rather aim his comment, maybe not quite the direction he was intending, because that idea of that semi-independence of government policy, I suppose that's aiming at the wonderful work that you're doing. So yes, thank you, thanks for clarifying that, David, as well. So I'll just move on to the comment from Chris. First of all, thanks you all, and then he endorsed the policy to change accountability systems in primary schools, but DFE policy and funding and Ofsted inspections continue to emphasise terms like originally catch-up and now recovery, and there remains a strong in-school focus on closing gaps against targets such as FFT. Sadly, this is what schools are expected to demonstrate to inspection teams. So baseline, I think that's supposed to be, phonics tests and the like, are the damaging but essential benchmarks while schools continue to be judged by measures of progress. And he just put, and I haven't even mentioned the white paper.
Yeah. Well, I think those are very fair points, but that's why there's some very good work conducted at UCL led by Professor Gemma Moss. We can't just expect this that you can catch up and squash the learning in a very short period of months when children have been out of school or have lost learning opportunities. It's important to give time to catch up and not just to assume you can ram it all in. And there's been a great disappointment in the tutoring provision that it hasn't worked well with school. These tutors that are supposedly going to help with this, they haven't been of the right quality, many people have found, and I think an evaluation has shown that it's been quite a waste of money. It's better that the teachers who know the students, the children, if we're talking primary age, will know more about the learning needs of those children. So yes, what can we say? I mean, that is, it's the judgment, and that's why not contextualizing and not using, not reducing, refocusing inspection to be a more improvement-based and support schools to help, particularly those that are facing the most challenging communities. That's been a big issue, and it wasn't always the case with Ofsted. They did use the contextualised school performance, and schools will get recognised if they were doing a lot to add value. But the high-stakes testing is detrimental, we think. pernicious in its effects on teaching and learning and on children at that young age.
There's it's interesting. We've talked about obviously our own changes of practice. So Angela has put in the comments that learning from potentially Western Australia, she's pointed to a solution to elastic.com, which is an education software which has transformed their learning outcomes in Western Australia, is now being tried in primary schools in England. And so it's very effective in identifying learning gaps and providing solutions.
Yeah,
very good.
Good to know. Yes, I mean technology used appropriately.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
And that's why we think the digital hub and the Oxford Institute. There's a lot of interest with one of our colleagues, Rebecca Enyon, who's between the Oxford the Internet Institute, the Internet Institute and our department. But they've got a lifelong learning project about how she says one of the problems is we see IT as a solution, and there's a lot of interest in the potential of AI, but their experience, if we're not very careful, is it would just replicate or exacerbate existing inequities. So if those who have get richer in a sense because they already have the good provision at home and they can have support, their learning will go further than the young people who haven't got those opportunities. So we have to make sure that it's used in a positive way to narrow gaps and to expand opportunities. So it's potentially a good, but it could exacerbate inequities if it's not used in that positive way.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any last comments? I'm aware of time, so does anyone have any last comments or questions? But before we wrap up, I'll just keep an eye on the chat box. If you do have just post it at the moment, while I just let you know, in fact, is a nice segue into what the college is doing. I'm delighted to say that our next event is on Saturday, where we have the next performance in the Jesus Shakespeare project, which we do for local schools and for alumni. So if you'd like to come and see the Taming of the Shrew, which I was at the dress rehearsal yesterday off, so it's a very lively afternoon. We have very few limited tickets left, so do go on the website on Saturday afternoon. And the next part of this series will be looking at the climate crisis and what we eat will impact on that with Professor Susan Jebb, and that will be on the 16th of June. So I think, thanks to Pam from Oxford Spires.
I was a governor at Oxford Spires in the past, so thank you.
Fantastic. So I think, therefore, all it remains for me to do is thank our speakers so very much for giving their time tonight for this fascinating discussion. I think we all agree this is one of the biggest challenges that faces, especially in the light of COVID and the pandemic and the effect it's had on young people and children. So to thank Meg, to thank Kathy, to thank Pam again, and also to thank all of you for joining us. And yes, we hope to see you either back in college in person again or at our continuation of these Zoom events. So thank you very much and hope you have a lovely evening. Goodbye.